Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we are once again going to a new state that we have not talked about on the podcast before. We're going to Florida, where I've actually just come back from for a family trip. So, to welcome on the state of Florida, we have Will Hensler, the CEO, and Rick deMontmillon. I already messed that up. Montmillon, VP of production of St. Augustine Distillery in Florida. So, both of you, welcome on.
David, I'm going to give you one correction. I'm the COO, but I appreciate the promotion.
What did I say? CEO?
I think so.
I think I said COO in my head and it just went wrong. So I promoted you. Congratulations. um, St. Augustine is not only one of the older distilleries, craft distilleries in the country, definitely part of that first, second wave kind of edge, but third distillery, third beverage alcohol distillery in Florida, first one making whiskeys, bourbons of any type. So there's a lot to get into with the history here. So we're going to intersperse that history throughout as opposed to starting with the origin story. So to start, I wanted to ask about this very, this is going to be a very esoteric point, but when the distillery was getting started and you were finding the space, I love this little detail from a piece done in 2015 that the building originally had to be bought as two separate parcels so that the distillery could be the distillery and bar were technically separate, even though they occupied the same facility. We're now 10 years on from, that article and more than that on from when you've started. Is that still a requirement in the state?
So I'll kind of take it back. When our project was started, it was started alongside our neighbors at the Ice Plant Bar and Restaurant. And what we learned was, you couldn't hold a distilling license and a bar license at the same time in the state of Florida. And that is still the case, but craft distilleries have grown a whole new level of permissions, and we've been fortunate or proud to be a part of kind of that legislative development. Part of it is craft distilleries can now serve cocktails in the state of Florida. However, our neighbors in the same building have a full bar. They carry other spirits, not just ours. And that would not be allowed under a craft distilling license. So while it's changed, and if you visit other crafts around the state, many of them do have small cocktail bars. They're using all their own spirits. And if they have modifiers that are alcoholic, all their own produced modifiers. So although it's progressed to function the way that we and our neighbors function, would still require this separate licensing.
Gotcha. So just to set a little context, because again, we've never talked about Florida before on the podcast, and I like to just get a little background. When the distillery was getting started, this idea between up to 24 families at one point of getting started, was there much distilling history in Florida? I know I mentioned before you were the third one making beverage alcohol now, but was there much kind of distillation history, whiskey in particular?
No, there really wasn't. And you mentioned the families. I think this was a really ambitious project in a lot of ways. And, not least of which you get in front of people and you say, hey, we want to make a distillery. And they're like, what even is that? So it's really fun that our founders were able to kind of get 22 different families together that really wanted to invest in this idea and bring up the local neighborhood that we're in, which is called Lincolnville, and really kind of drive that forward for St. Augustine. So no, there wasn't much history, and there's none that we know of in this area.
It's funny. Our distillery retains a lot of aesthetic and kind of its vibe from the period of the facility, which was built in the early 1900s. So naturally, there's a little bit of Prohibition influence in here, both here in the facility and beyond. And while there's no traditional bourbon production that we could track in the state of Florida, we did learn a whole lot about illicit production of unaged whiskeys that occurred in this area. And North Florida in particular has kind of a history of moonshine production through Prohibition and even before some backwoods distilling. And, part of our journey was to kind of unearth that and make it part of our experience. When you come visit the distillery, you kind of learn the tradition and history of spirits in North Florida. An interesting thing, the county that we're in now is St. Johns County, but back 100 years ago, it was all grouped into what is known as Duval County, which is the same county that Jacksonville, Florida is in. And that county was actually the last wet county in the state of Florida. So we like to say we went kicking and screaming into Prohibition over here.
Fair enough. And I would imagine certainly, if not legal stuff, illicit, as you said, with all the sugar cane you guys have, then there's got to be a lot of sugar shine that would have been made.
Sure. we are in a region. I grew up in Florida, as did Rick, and I've kind of bounced around the state. I grew up in Central Florida, both West Coast, East Coast, kind of moving around along that Central Florida equator, if you will. And it's really down south you see the sugarcane production. So it certainly assists us in working with local providers, getting good molasses, whatever the case is. But up here in North Florida, it's almost a completely different climate. And the early days of our distillery, we actually had a sugarcane plot out front of the distillery. Our owners had worked with local farms about 10, 20 miles from the distillery to grow sugarcane in St. Johns County for the first time. And it took one hard freeze for us to realize how impractical that is. And it just truly is a different climate up here than it is in South Florida, where it's more tropical.
When you got started, there were, we talked about it in Florida, but nationwide, like maybe 250 distilleries, somewhere around that area. And now we've got, that's 10% of what we've got now, if not less. I think we hit over 4,000, and then now it's starting to fall down a little bit. So definitely first wave after the protos of like St. George, excuse me, and Clear Creek and Germain Robin. In the beginning, you got a lot of your influence and knowledge from ADI, American Distilling Institute, which has been, doing their convening since 2003, really before the craft even got started in the US. And ADI has played a really big role throughout the creation and development of St. Augustine Distillery. So just throwing a few things out there, it's how you got introduced to Dave Pickerel. You still use a lot of the vendors that you met at those conferences. You're now partnered with Moonshine University, and you're doing executive bourbon stewards more than any place outside of Kentucky, correct?
Mm-hmm. And we were the first group sanctioned to teach the actual second level executive bourbon steward outside of the Moonshine U Stave and Thief headquarters. So we were honored to be able to offer that to our guests.
Right. So, so ADI and its network has been incredibly important. One of the things I wanted to hit on first was that, Rick, you mentioned this, that you're in Lincolnville, mm-hmm. and community and the sense of community has been a major point since the ideation. And when we think about Dave Pickerel in this context, it's usually about the production side. We're talking about how he created a mash bill or set up your stills or things like that. And yes, he had input there, but here there's also a focus on how he helped to design the engagement with the community. And we forget that besides being master distiller over at Maker's Mark, he also ran their gift shop for many years. And this is something that is kind of an under talked about skill that he had, that he brought clearly to St. Augustine quite a bit. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, how he influenced that engagement from the beginning.
Yeah. So going back to ADI for a second, I mean, they've been massive for us over the years. It really started in the 2011 Portland ADI. That's really where we kind of figured out, yeah, you can make this thing work and you can actually make a go of this. But that's where we met Leah Hutchison for the first time. Shout out to Leah from Tappy. We love her. She introduced the company to Dave Pickerel. And you're right. I mean, I think probably the worst kept secret in the industry was that Dave was really focused on the customer experience. And that's what he was all about. I mean, he would tell you all the time that you have a bunch of levers to success, right? You have to have good juice, you have to have a good bottle, you have to have a good story. But on the outside of that, people have to come in the building, they have to love what they're seeing, they have to laugh, they have to cry, they have to be engaged with your brand. And Dave was really the guy that kind of put that forward and said, yeah, I mean, you've got all this beautiful scenery around you, you got all these people that are coming to St. Augustine for the history, lean into that, make it really work.
Love it. In addition to Dave, were there other figures or distilleries that you went to, visited, that ended up influencing St. Augustine's development?
I'll take this one, Rick. I think our development is kind of a mix of folks that inspired us from a product standpoint. Our owners had a strong appreciation for malted whiskeys. On the American whiskey side, they were more stricken by wheated bourbons. So the connection with Dave made perfect sense, understanding what he was producing at the time and before. And from an experience standpoint, from what we offer here, it was driven by a number of distilleries, even beyond. We look toward the wine world on how to create a really high-end, high-class, breathtaking experience, and look to St. Augustine on how you make that kind of relative and represent the environment in the region that you are a part of, right? So you speak of Lincolnville, it was, it's a really historic community. It's on the nation's registry of historic places, but it was kind of a blighted community at the time that we got started, and took a leap of faith. Our owners did, rather, to purchase this building and spend years renovating it, and then creating what was at the time, as you said, the third craft distillery in the state of Florida. And while that was fantastic, we are probably more proud of the awards we've seen to restore this historic facility, or as proud as we are of any of the awards we've received for our spirits. But what also makes us happy is the businesses that have followed and the job creation that has followed in this community. As we speak, they're building a hotel next door to our facility. It's going to be 450 rooms, and of course, the jobs that go along with it. And all the while, with this commercial expansion, Lincolnville has retained its heritage and its feel, and we're just proud to play some kind of role in that.
It was one of the, not only you said it was a blighted community when you moved in, it's one of the oldest African American communities.
That's correct.
In the U.S.
And we partner with the Lincolnville Cultural Heritage Museum, who tells that story still today. Actually, the directors of the museum are some of our original investors.
Fantastic. And yeah, you've got a couple of local connections there. There's also the, what was it? The amphitheater.
Yeah.
I'm one of your directors in the local amphitheater. So there's connection with there. So I like it. It's the tendrils are throughout the community, and it's very much a back and forth between them. I'm going to touch on the tourism in a second, but just on a functional side, in the, let's say, 14 years that you've been, I'd say the decade plus since you've been operational and had the idea and put it into place, what's been your advice for managing the input of 22 families?
That's a perfect question. We're always open to collaboration is how I would answer that. Our owners and our leadership team that Rick and I are proud to be a part of ultimately make the decisions on what happens in the organization. But I don't care if you're a tour guide, a cashier, a customer, or an investor. Good input is good input, and we welcome it always. That's how we get better.
It's been, it takes family owned to a new level for sure. So I read a piece in Voyage Jacksonville. So this was also from 2015. So right after, a year after you guys opened to the public, there was a Florida law prohibiting investment or ownership of a distillery by an out-of-state entity. And at the time, that was seen as kind of a significant barrier to growth. Now, granted, this is 10 years ago. So I guess my two questions are, one, is that still the case? And if so, are you working to take care of that? And two, what kind of growth were they envisioning that could happen with that kind of investment?
So
I can take it if you want, Rick.
no, I mean, I'm happy to if you want to. So yes, long story short, that is still in place. We cannot accept outside investment. As far as the growth question is concerned, I think the way that the ownership views this is that we're trying to build a brand. We're trying to stay here. We're trying to make as much whiskey as we can, welcome as much people in. I think the reason why that's in place to begin with is to keep giant companies from coming in and just plastering whiskey all over Disney World, all over Universal, things that really wouldn't be good for the local families in Florida. So it makes sense for that law to exist. Do we wish we could accept investment from the outside? Absolutely. Who doesn't want to grow? But we understand that that's kind of the game that we're playing in the state of Florida, and we're happy to grow from our hometown.
Yeah, and I think one other piece, even outside of that, is retaining craft status in Florida has to do with total production, right? So if you produce more than 250,000 gallons of product, you no longer retain the status of craft, which in our case means we lose the ability to sell direct to customers here in the facility. If we had a bar at our facility, which we do not, but many, many distillers throughout the state now do, same kind of thing. You get 1% investment from another producing organization, be it Bacardi or whoever, all of a sudden you've reached that production limit and you no longer can function as craft, which even to us, as we've grown over the last decade, our business relies on our on-site experience as much as it does in our wholesale activities, our normal 3-tier activities.
It's funny. I sometimes forget as we go state by state, there's always something in the state that has kind of an overriding influence on things. And I forget for Florida in particular, this idea of, entry into Universal and Disney World, these that plays heavily in the thought of, okay, how are outside companies coming in, regardless of, you could be hours away from there, and it's still going to be part of the thought process. So,
Something I should mention with that too, real quick.
Yeah.
It's keep in mind that when we started this company, you could not sell a bottle directly to someone that came in the building. If someone came and visited the distillery, we had to sell that bottle to a distributor first in order to make sure that they could actually have a taste of it. So it was really difficult for us on day one. And of course, our CEO has been able to successfully change the law multiple times within the state, and it's a different game now. But what we envisioned on day one is totally, totally different from the reality that we live in now. And that, of course, that's a great thing. But when you're setting up a company, you never envision that you're ever going to have the conversation, could we possibly sell to a giant company?
Sure. So I think that's a good intro into the tourism angle, which is, I think, as with many craft distilleries that start around the country, people in the door, feet in the door is how you guys get started. It's how you keep the lights on the first few years, and just how you keep money coming in. But unlike others who have kind of struggled with that or are still kind of finding their feet, you guys have taken it to a whole new level of success that I really have not seen before on this side of the Atlantic, for sure. So the city of St. Augustine gets 1 million plus visitors and tourists a year. The last count I saw, you got 175,000 to the distillery per year, which is bananas insane. And for a craft distillery, having almost 20% of the total tourism in the city coming to see you is incredible. What was that like at the beginning? Because I know you said at the beginning this was an area that didn't necessarily have the tourism. It was outside the central city where people were visiting. How has that tourism grown over the years, and how have you adapted to that?
So I'll start that with kind of a tale of a partnership, and I think that explains most of what we've been able to achieve thanks to St. Augustine's tourism. We have a winery about 2 blocks from us, San Sebastian Winery, and before we got started, our owners had a great relationship. Gentleman Charles, shout out to Charles Cox, who owns San Sebastian Winery, and Charles had marched a similar path, right? He'd worked to earn privileges to sell his bottles. He ultimately worked his way all the way up to DTC. We haven't gotten that win yet. But Charles' advice was a couple of things. Look, if you create an incredible experience that can be enjoyable for novices, newcomers, and aficionados, you can have a thriving business. But it's going to take working with local tourism partners to get folks in the door. And I think there's no more important relationship than the one we have with Old Town Trolley here in St. Augustine, operated by Historic Tours of America. They've got attractions all over the nation, but one of their bread and butter activities is a sightseeing trolley. It brings people around the historic parts of St. Augustine and drops them off at attractions. And before our owners even struck the deal to purchase this facility, which we got to talk about the facility at some point, it's pretty cool. But we worked to ensure we could be a stop on that trolley route. And that deal was locked in before we even purchased the building, before our owners did, rather. And still today, they bring a large portion of our visitors. It's a great way to see the city. You can park in one centralized location, and these things take you around to the winery, the distillery, several other attractions and spots to visit. And even beyond that, working with our local marketing DMO, Florida's Historic Coast, it's the Visitors and Conventions Bureau here, to make sure the distillery is properly represented, working with Visit Florida on a statewide level, and just understanding that, while we are a distillery and we believe our products are as good as any in the market, we also have the challenge and opportunity of maintaining an attraction. I put us up against any attraction in St. Augustine. So come take a tour and learn about the fascinating process of distillation. And that's what we've just been able to build on over the years. Now it's expanded to working with hotels and concierges to make sure guests are aware of the distillery, and just doing anything you can to get the word out.
Love it. And you also, this is just a smaller thing, but it is something to note. If you're partnering with the trolleys and with other systems around the city, you don't have that issue that a lot of distilleries that are kind of out of the cities have of drinking and driving. Hopefully that's less of an issue. So yeah, let's jump into the building itself. So you're in a 15,000 square foot ish building. So it's not a huge space. I should say.
No.
And you guys accomplish a lot in that space. So I'll throw it to you guys to talk about what that space is, and then we'll go into production to talk about what you do in the space.
Cool. I'll touch the building, and then Rick, you can talk production.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the facility itself was built in 1905. It was Florida's first commercial ice plant. They made ice here way back before refrigeration was around or commonplace, certainly. It was owned by Florida Power and Light, who's still the main energy provider for the state of Florida. And anybody who grew up in St. Augustine has always known this facility as the old ice plant. If you come here today, we've got ourselves St. Augustine Distillery and our neighbors next door at the Ice Plant Bar. And if you look up on the facade of the facility, you'll see the lettering for Ice Plant. You might assume it was put there for the businesses. It wasn't. It was put there, over 100 years ago. And they produced block ice here. Most of it was used for commercial shipping. So this is over the rail transportation of things like seafood coming out of St. Augustine, brought up to the Northeast on Flagler's Railroad. And in the mid 1950s, refrigeration became cheap or commonplace enough that they ceased ice production. And from that time to when our owners purchased the building, a few businesses kind of came and went, but the property itself was still held by Florida Power and Light. And our owners were able to secure the facility, and we spent over 2 years really just renovating the building. And we knew from the beginning it was going to be part of our story. Not only is it the story of time in St. Augustine, there's also this natural connection of ice and spirits. And certainly when you're bringing cocktails into the mix. So we knew it become part of our story. And some of the best advice we got early on came from Mr. Pickerel, which was, look, if you're going to have a successful spirit brand, you need three things. You need good juice, got to taste good. You need a good bottle. It's got to look good on the shelf to stand out. And you need a good story. And, when you're a heritage distillery that's been producing for over a century, the story's pretty clear. When you're a new craft distillery making a spirit that its region is not known for, I think it's even more crucial that you have a story you can tell to your visitors and your fans. So that's what I'll say for the facility. And Rick's certainly the man for production.
And Rick, just before you jump in there, I just want to insert for a second. If people haven't heard the name Henry Flagler, is someone who, not to take a huge detour on this, but is probably single-handedly responsible for more development of Florida as a destination, as a place people not only visit, but stay, from the Panhandle to the Keys. Late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, was involved with all the barons. I read about him a lot in the book on John Rockefeller. So really interesting character up and down the state of Florida that happened to have a really big impact on St. Augustine in particular. So just wanted to throw that in there.
No, I'm glad you did. It's really fascinating. Even the Floridians, most folks think of Palm Beach when they think of Henry Flagler. He built the breakers. It's what is now the Whitehall Museum down there. But St. Augustine was like his first go at it, and his legacy is still here. I mentioned the connection to our facility, but Flagler College was a high-end hotel originally known as the Ponce de Leon Hotel, built in 1888, I think, and all over this city, whether it's cathedrals or vintage old-time hotels, the footprint is here for sure.
Yeah. So jumping over to production, I want to just cite a couple of things here. So, Rick, you were on Voices of Distilling just a couple months ago at the end of 2024 to talk about, among other things, the production of the facility. And one of the things you said was the brand has always been to highlight Florida. And you gave the comparison example of how Maryland has highlighted rye.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this a lot. And obviously you have the cane sugar that you use to make the non-whiskeys, because you can't make it for the whiskeys, and it may come from a different part of Florida, but still Floridian for sure. Up to a certain point, the bourbon mash bill, 60% Florida corn, 18% Florida wheat. The barley I know doesn't grow in Florida, so that has to come from elsewhere. But these are Florida grains. I don't want to get you in trouble, for sure, so go with me on this. But the same month, your Michael Diaz was in a different interview and said that you're no longer focusing purely on a Florida focus, more on making the best spirits possible from the best available ingredients. Now, maybe that's not a dissonance. Maybe that's just a different source within Florida. But I just wanted to kind of throw that at the beginning to say, is there still a focus on Florida grains as much as possible.
As much as possible, yeah. And I don't see that as a dissonance because what it comes down to is we get Florida grain as much as we possibly can. There are times a year where Florida is just frankly too damn hot, and a lot of the grain does not grow well. And we have to go outside the state of Florida to find the best quality. And we're very, very focused on the quality of what we're giving our customer first and foremost. To us, it comes less down to the source of the grain and making sure that the consumer tastes the bottle and they say, wow, this is fantastic. Because we think that's extremely important, way more important than the source of the grain. But to answer your question, the way that we emphasize Florida agriculture, we use cane for our vodka and gin. We use Florida citrus in part of our gin recipe as well. The molasses that we use for our rum is from the state of Florida. It comes from the cane fields that are just south of Okeechobee. And up until this point, the majority of the grain that we have that's aging in our barrels is Florida corn and wheat. We transition out of that a little bit for quality issues, but we still have a lot of that stuff aging.
Sure. And of course, it's not always about just the grains. There's a lot of other things that go into it to make it, highlighting Florida. So we should not say that just because you have to transition out sometimes, you're going to lose that. But I just wanted to bring it up because it was something that I know was important to you, was important to the production. And, it's always important and you guys are very transparent. I want to throw that out there too. So, so jumping into the production, you mill in-house. So again, it's not a lot of room, but you have a hammer mill on site.
Well, in-house is the wrong term. It's actually right outside the door. So,
oh, right. Okay, fair enough. And you're doing it 6:30 or 7 in the morning. And I think I heard you say, this cloud of corn dust can just come off the mill in the morning, and God help you if there's rain, you'll have grits on your car.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Is that? I mean, I guess a lot of places do mill in-house or adjacent, if you will. But had you thought about milling off-site at all, or was this from the beginning you were going to do this on-site?
We thought about it. I mean, as you may well be aware, Florida is extremely humid. Making
sure that was my first concern, honestly.
Yeah, and it's mine too, all the time. So pre-milled grains, that can be an issue, or milling them off-site and bringing them in. We want to make sure that we're making them as fresh as possible, and the way that we ensure that is by milling on-site. Yeah.
No, look, that makes sense. We usually think of having to dry the grains to between 11 and 14% moisture, depending on what the grain is. And so it can be a little difficult when it's 90% humidity for a big part of the year. So you've got the grain, you've milled it in-house, goes into the cookers and the fermenters. So something that I was surprised at, I don't know why I was surprised, but go with me, was that you use a sweet mash as opposed to sour mashing. So, Dave would have he did do sweet mash some places, but Makers is a sour mash. What kind of gave you the push to go in the sweet mash direction?
Honestly, I think it's that we never felt like we had to sour mash. I think a lot of times people sour mash because they're afraid of inconsistency, or times a year they get different ferments, they get different grain quality. We have not had that issue as much, and we think that we already get tons of consistency. And to be honest, you were asking about production space and the size of the building that we're in. I mean, the term that we use, it's 10 pounds of crap in a 5-pound sack all the time here. So, when you don't have room, adding in one more tank that you're going to put any backset in or anything like that is just, it's not available most of the time.
True. And the mash bill itself is, you've described it as more like it's more like a malted bourbon as opposed to a wheated bourbon.
Yes.
Just because the malt content is it's 22% against the wheat's 18%. How did that mash bill get developed as well?
So as Will mentioned earlier, both of our owners are huge malt whiskey fans, and I think that was part of it. I think maybe by providence, we kind of learned a little bit from the Scotch industry. I think we learned that, a high humidity, low temperature does something really nice for aging out malted whiskeys. But what we had to figure out, and you were asking earlier about, what makes us extremely Florida, and I would say more than anything, more than grains, more than location, it's environment that we're in. Because high humidity, high heat is something that we had the luck to figure out. first. Nobody else really got in front of that and said, I know exactly how to do high humidity, high heat. So we got to figure it out. But luckily, malt actually ages really well in our high humidity environment. It pulls out lots of nutty notes, lots of dark chocolate, things that we're really excited about. So, we've had the option to change the mash bill away from being a high malt bourbon many times over the years, and we've specifically chosen not to for that reason.
I mean, I like that idea. You're right that malt can act really nicely in hot environments. We think of it as Scotland and Ireland because that's where a lot of it comes from. But if you look at, I'm just thinking out loud, places around the world, Okinawa in Japan and southern Japan and India, Goa in India gets incredibly hot and humid, and they're producing amazing malt whiskeys around the world in this environment that doesn't come to mind when you think of it necessarily. But within that, it can age very well. But before that, we got to get to the yeast and fermentation. So depending on it sounds like the time of year and what's going on, you have somewhere between a 4 and 8 day fermentation.
Correct.
So that's a significant differential to be working between. And that's I should mention, that's with a temperature controlled tank, which you have to have because it's just too hot. The yeast would die off otherwise. So 4 to 8 days, 50%, 100%, or doubling, however you want to put it. How do you manage that differential and know when to let it run and when to stop it?
Yeah. So actually, I got to give another shout out here. Maggie Campbell actually introduced this idea to us.
It's a privateer rum, right?
Correct. Yeah. So she actually gave us some incredible advice at one point, which was that when you're running a 7-day schedule, sometimes it's better to go in and mash in a specific profile that you want to be a little more neutral, and that gives you a chance to kind of line up one out of every several that will have this kind of neat, clean profile as opposed to something that ferments really quickly. So we took that and we started doing several 4-day ferments offset by one 8-day ferment for bourbon. And it actually turned out really nice. We'd end up with a little bit cleaner product right there on the end that we could mix in with all the other stuff. And it makes it really neat. It gives us some barrel differentiation, which we've been working on a lot over the past couple of years. I'd say it's been my major focus because we were so consistent. But additionally, we're just really happy with the way it turns out. I mean, we get really excellent yields off of the 8-day fermentations.
And I'll jump to the rum in just a few minutes because I got to ask you about the rum as well. I do want to recognize you guys do the vodka and gin as well. This is just strictly for time that we're not talking too much about those. So one of the other things in the production process was this. So you're using Vendome stills, that's normal. That's expected. And when you guys got them, there wasn't the 5-year waiting period. So you might have to wait a little bit, but not the 5-year. But you do an off-grain distillation.
No, we do on-grain.
You do on-grain. Oh, that was...
Yes, we do.
Oh, I got to check that source then. Because, it said that the sources said that you separated the liquid off from the chaff before doing it. I was like, that's unusual for an American spirit. So, okay, you guys are doing on-grain. That makes more sense. So it's, but so even then, so you get into out of the fermenters into the stills, you do have to make tighter hearts cuts, as you said. And the reason being, you can clarify this, but the reason that I've heard is simply that you don't have as long to age. You got the high humidity, the high heat. Even in a 53 gallon, you're going to go through it faster. So it's not as long to allow for those more volatile heads or the heavier tails to, for lack of a better term, mature in the barrels and become what they're supposed to be. Was this something that you kind of intuited from the beginning, or were there some early barrels that just had a wider cut that didn't quite work out?
No, it's been a learning process the entire 10 years. I can tell you that. But these days our cuts are very tight. I mean, I'm proud to say 2 of the employees that work in production have been here for over 10 years, and that's just that's some in-house experience that you can't pay for that kind of experience. It's both of these guys are incredible. I mean, we'll be working on something else sometimes, and it's just like an alarm goes off in their head, and they're like, "Oh, we got to go check the still," and we've got it down to a science, at least for our profile. We really absolutely love what we've been doing, and we've been getting better yields than ever.
You can't underestimate the value of keeping people on. Like, turnover is pretty high in the industry right now. used to be that someone was a company guy, you stay at Beam for 40 years or something. But with this new wave of craft distilleries across the country, keeping people for more than a couple of years is really a testament. And you only find it in the best distilleries, the ones that have created the best environment for their employees and support for their employees. I know you guys do. You mentioned this a little bit earlier that you do a ton of employee education. Everyone goes to Save and Thief. Everyone gets it. So you don't have the tour guides who don't really know the answers to questions or anything. It's that you put a lot into it. So I just want to note that having people stay on shows that it's working and that you guys are doing something right.
We want everyone that works here to be very educated, but more importantly, when they leave us, at some point they will. We want them to be successful outside of us. I mean, they're here while they're here, and we love them, and we love everything they do for and with us. But it's extremely important that we invest in them as people, and I think they see that.
Will, you look like you were going to jump in on something.
Yeah, I just got to give a shout out to one of those, really both those guys who've been here for 10 years. Our head distiller, Daniel Jocelyn, who's really been super impactful in this team and helping improve the quality of our spirits for over a decade. And then a guy named Danny Rodriguez that we call Day One Danny. So if you're looking at the products, you might have seen our D. Rodriguez and Sons rum. That's made kind of in honor of Danny. Danny was literally the first employee at the distillery. He was part of the crew that renovated the building. And our owners, in addition to Dave Pickrell, are working with a number of consultants, one of whom was Jake Norris. And Jake gave him great advice in the beginning. He said, look, neither of you are whiskey makers, neither are you mechanical engineers. Things are going to break every day, and you need the dude who's going to fix them. You need your MacGyver. And it became clear that Danny was that guy, just in how he led the crews restorating this facility. And he came on as our very first distiller. And I think Rick would say still to this day, he's one of our best distillers. And he's just an incredible soul. He's a father figure to the guys.
Yeah, I mean, we put out the D. Rodriguez and Sons rum once a year, and the production team calls it Father's Day, because we treat him exactly like that. I mean, he's just such an inspiration. He's such a hardworking guy, and he's, for lack of a better term, he's just got his head on straight. I mean, he knows what he's doing, and he's a family man, and we love him so much.
There is one source that I was using for the research that is just called The Legend of Day One Danny. So yeah. He's got his legend out there. I just realized I missed one of the whiskey fermentation questions. Which, for nerdy, we got to ask these questions. So 22% barley is fairly high in a bourbon it's just fairly high in a bourbon. I don't know why I've qualified that. So you have enough barley in the mash to provide the amylases that you would need for the sugars. And especially with that ambient heat kind of jumpstarting them even further. Mm-hmm. Do you just use those, the amylases from the barley, or do you also pitch enzymes to help it go a little faster?
We pitch enzymes as well. We do a 3-step mash in. And as anybody who is a distiller listening to this will know, you get a really gummy mash right at the beginning if you're just going in with your corn. So we use a little bit of enzyme to kind of loosen that up at the beginning, but by the time we get to the 3rd step, where we're actually putting the malt in, we're all malt enzyme at that point.
Actually, I've heard you can put the malt in there, and within minutes, it thins out into what we think of as a final wort that's bubbling away and all that. So something that has changed over the years, and decade plus, things are going to change, is your entry proof off the still. So at one point, it was as low as 110. Mm-hmm. One interview in July of 2022, it was about 115 at that point, and as of July of last year, it was 120. So are you still playing around with that, or is that you feel like the 120 is the final, or do you go between?
I think 120 is the spot. I mean, that's almost all we've been doing recently, and I know some of the traditional ideas that you'll get with that is your low proof is going to pull more of those water solubles. They're going to be more, caramel heavy. They're going to have a lot of that toasted layer in there, which is absolutely true. But there's some other solubles that you get at a higher proof that are also very desirable. And we figured out slowly over time that in this hot environment, you would think that a high proof would emphasize a lot of that heat. It'd be really strong ethanol. It'd just be a lot of burn on the mouth at the beginning. But we've learned that that's actually not true in our environment. We get a really smooth, nice product. It allows us to put out cast strength products that are a little higher that a lot of people are expecting these days. But most importantly, we are still filling barrels that are low proof as well. So one of the things that you might have seen in your research, we've been talking about it a lot recently, we don't rotate our barrels. We don't really see the benefit in that. We see the benefit in blending. So one of the things that we do is we put away a lot of extremely low proof barrels, usually around 86 proof. And the reason why we do that is we can fold it back in. It allows us to maintain the integrity of the bourbon when we're blending, but it allows us to kind of push that standard entry point up a little bit, and we kind of get the best of both worlds.
Or if someone's going down to 86, you're getting close to that level where you can't call it whiskey anymore. So
well, there's a reason why it's 86.
Exactly.
The lowest proof drop we've ever seen in this facility is 6 proof, so that's why I put it right there.
that would do it. All right, so I like that as the 120, and it makes sense too. You're right, and we talked about it on the podcast before. You get more of those wood sugars in a lower proof with the water having more of an effect, but I think that also, and this is just educated speculation, you guys probably know this better than I do, as having been on production side and in the industry, but the water interactions with the wood where you're getting those wood sugars is also more when you're dealing with lower temperatures and oxidation, as opposed to pushing the spirit in and out of the wood. And if you guys are, you're not temperature controlling, you're not rotating, you've got heat and humidity all year round, there's not that much time or space for those the water specific reactions to happen at the same level as it would if it's winter in Kentucky, let's say.
Exactly. And our commitment to Florida is that we don't temperature control, and I don't think we ever will, honestly, because we love the interactions that we get in the heat and the humidity, and we think that our job, in order to represent Florida really well, is to continue to put those barrels out in that environment and adjust everything else to that. That's the one thing we can't change, is the environment that we're in, and honestly, we don't want to. We think it makes us unique, and we love what Kentucky's doing. We love all those other brands out there, but this is our chance to stand up and do something that's purely us, and we can lean into our environment and make sure that everybody understands that we've made every other adjustment to that.
Love it. Love it. So just to jump over to rum for a second and rum production, so you guys dedicate yourselves fully to rum in the summer, as far as I know. So what has to change when you go over to the rum production? Do you use a different yeast or different distillation techniques? Like, what do you have to change, or what stays the same?
I'll jump in because the reason we make it in the summer is one of my favorite facts I've learned from Rick and the production team, which is really a couple of things. One, we notice the grain quality takes a hit that time of year, right? So that's when we make the adjustment to molasses. And two, the molasses is more viscous and easier to deal with when it's 100 degrees in the facility. It's just, sometimes simple is the answer.
That is a damn good point. You are, yeah.
But as far as prep, Rick, you can keep me honest, but like anything, when you're transitioning spirits, it's all about cleanliness, right? You're cleaning fermenters, you're cleaning stills. Oftentimes we'll do our deep maintenance during this period before we made this changeover. This year was really a comprehensive overhaul. Took the columns off the stills, replaced all the gaskets. Of course, Danny helped and supported us along the journey there. But, it's just making sure that we're starting with a completely sanitary environment before we make that changeover. And I think it keeps focus on what we're producing, where it's not kind of schizophrenic because we're back and forth each day between whiskey and rum and whatever the demand is there for. We've got 10 years of history showing generally the amount of product we need to produce. So we feel we can do it, at least now, within a couple of months during the year, and allows the guys to stay focused on making the best rum they can. And we switch over and make the best whiskey we can.
Awesome. And you're already doing sweet mash, so you already got the higher level of cleanliness kind of in the blood of the distillery.
Correct. So, it's more acidic, yeah.
Makes sense. But no, I love that. You're right, Will. I love that fact that molasses is easier to deal with when it's hotter. So, this next production point is my last question on production. Specifically, tell me if this is just for whiskey or also applies to the other spirits, but you slow proof to avoid saponification. Mm-hmm. That's something that's we've debated at length on the podcast before. It seems to be very important for some, and others kind of poo-poo it. But for me, I love to hear it, especially for smaller producers and smaller production sizes. Was that also something that was from the beginning, this idea of slow proofing?
Oh yes, and I would say that it was probably more important at the beginning than when we got some experience with it, because that's the big thing, right? It's like you're always afraid that you're going to mess up the spirit, and you do it. You end up doing it twice as long as you actually need to to make it perfect, to make it just fine. So I'd say as of this point, we are still taking a lot of time proofing down bourbon, gin, and rum. Vodka, you can proof down pretty fast. You don't have to worry about that one as much. There's not a lot of oil in there you have to worry about. But yeah, we take our time, and especially on the marrying process for the bourbon. When we make Florida straight bourbon and we've got all 60 barrels in the tank, I mean, we'll spin that around for weeks before we actually start to pull back out and proof that down.
That's awesome. I love it. So jumping over, once we have the distillate, we put it into the barrels, now at 120. For the actually, I should ask, for the rum as well, is that also 120?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So maturation, we've talked about it and bounced around on it a few times here. You're in Florida. This is, we won't beat a dead horse. So the rick houses, because you're only got a 15,000 square foot facility, the rick houses are not on site.
No.
They're about 20 miles away, so still in the same band of weather, I think. Mm-hmm. So you've got 4 high in the center rack, 6 high around the wall. This may be a very open question, but if you had to boil down what maturation in Florida is like, where you are in Florida is like, what is like the one or two things that is the best? What's one thing is the best and one thing that drives you absolutely crazy?
I think maybe a good way to explain this, Rick, is kind of the history of our bourbon, right? Yeah. We first got started, like a lot of craft distilleries, the advice is use 25-gallon barrels, use small barrels. I say it'll age faster, but that's what people say. We've learned you can't cheat time. But it's, the idea was you'd have a sellable product within just a couple of years. And Florida does a number of things for our maturation. We get increased extraction at a really rapid rate. We get good color and some good flavor, but along with that comes bitterness and tannins and things that just take oxidation and maturity to age out. And we found our first batch of bourbon was getting over oaked. And these days we do full format 53-gallon barrels only. And Rick and his team are really, really selective about the origins of the oak. We mostly use Minnesota oak, Oakland, in cold climates. We're looking for a tighter grain pattern because we're kind of battling that increased extraction that we know we're going to experience. So that's number one. So we're kind of finding ways that we can hit 4, 5, 6 years, which truly to me is kind of the sweet spot for warm weather whiskey. Most of our barrels that go beyond 8 years or so run the danger of getting a little bitter. And then the reality of our increased angel share. One story that I always love to tell, when legislation changed in 2021 that finally removed our restrictions on bottle sales. At that time, we could sell 6 of any label to any customer. Nowadays, if we wanted to do a barrel pick for you, David, we could certainly do it. And I had a guy come in right afterwards and he said, I just had my first son. I want to lay down a barrel. And when he's 21 years old, I want you to bottle it. And him and I are going to enjoy it together. And I said, man, I am touched. It's an incredible story. But the barrel will be empty. There'll be nothing left in it. And that is the reality of producing whiskey in Florida. So we're always battling getting to the maturity level that we expect from a quality standpoint, and then fighting with the negative sides that can appear in Florida, both loss and undesired flavors. And I think over the last decade, Rick and his team have really honed their craft. We tell people we didn't get it right from day one. And we always invite you to come back and try our whiskey because we're trying to make it better every single year.
This has been a recurring theme recently on the podcast. God, I can't believe as of recording in 3 days or 4 days, it's going to be 4 years since I've been doing this podcast. And the number of distilleries that I either didn't like or didn't appreciate, I think it's more appropriate to say, a couple of years ago, and have really turned a corner and their stuff has matured really well now, is incredible. It's incredible to see. And a couple of years is a lifetime in craft distilling, even more so when you're maturing, as quickly as you are in Florida with your spirit. So no, I agree with you, and I really encourage people to retry things. Even if you didn't like them a couple years ago, try them now. Might be completely different.
Mm-hmm.
I do love this idea that you were using, Minnesota white oak because the tighter grain. I know what your angel share is, and we'll talk about that. I can't imagine what it would be like if you were using more open grain. But you have, let's see, what number barrel? Oh, so I think your oldest still aging barrel, if I have this right, is barrel 125.
Yeah,
it was
good
filled
job.
on October 2nd, 2014. I try.
Wow,
Man.
look at you.
I might have a miss or two, like the on grain, off grain, but I'll usually get it covered. So filled on October 2nd, 2014. So it's over 10 years old now. It's almost 10 and a half years old. And you're losing 10% a year or so. And that's, the first year you probably lost even more than that just by nature of how those things go. So this barrel is very, very low.
Oh, yeah.
Is what I've heard. So with this particular barrel, are you kind of just letting it go as far as it'll go and seeing at what point you end up with just dust in there, like bourbon dust?
So David, first off, I love that you mentioned that barrel specifically, because that barrel is kind of legendary around here. And the reason why is because it by itself represents our entire ethos. So that barrel, I would say, if I had to guess right now, it's probably 85, maybe 90% loss. But it wouldn't be that way if it was just 11 years old. The reason that it is that way is because that barrel sat in the facility and it was the easiest to reach for a long time, which means that our founders, who believe in sharing what they're doing with people more than they believe in making money off of this whiskey, drew and drew and drew samples out of that barrel. And I think it's a beautiful story, because when we look at that barrel and we go, man, this thing is empty, it just reminds us what we're really here for, which is to share it with the people that come in the building.
Okay, so that was your shiny barrel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, at this point, are you just gonna just let it go and see how long it'll go before it's
The
done?
timing of that question is perfect, because just this Thursday we're having a production meeting, and I pushed Rick to say we got to find a destination for those guys. So we think a couple of those barrels are going to be put together in a nice blend in our Bottle Your Own experience, which we redid last November.
Nice.
You can take a look on our website and see, but it's a really, really cool way to get into the bottling process, and more importantly, get to taste some of our very best single barrels that we offer here at the distillery. So I don't think any of us could stomach it going all the way down to zero, but it's certainly been an experiment. And, transparently, a lot of our original barrels do taste great, but a lot of them showcase how much we progress in the production processes, right? We're finding how we're cooking, how we're aging, yeast strains, everything that we're doing. So we're just as proud of our 4, 5, 6 year bourbon that's coming of age today as we are of some of those 10 plus year old barrels.
I mean, whenever you pull whatever's left in there, I would kill for like 100 ml sample with that. Forget the whole bottle, like leave that for the whole bottle experience, which I do love those experiences. I really do. But just to see what that's like after, 11 years. No,
Very oaky.
incredible.
I can tell you that. Very, very oaky.
That's true. I was going to say that's true. I might not like it because I don't like a ton of oak in my whiskey. But it as you said, it's a showcase, one showcase for the many ways that you've grown over the years. This was a little bit of a different question, actually, two of them. So, first one is, you guys used to use a range between like 18 to 24 month, air seasoned staves in the barrels, and that was that tight grained white oak. Now you've switched to the 18, just frankly because the 24 month got very expensive with more demand in the industry. Have you noticed so far any difference with like that 6 months of the air seasoning?
Yes, absolutely. And we, just to take a step back for a second, we didn't choose the 18-month. The 18-month happened to us through COVID. I'm sure that you've heard this a lot, but barrel availability was really bad at that time, and we just kind of had to get what we could get. And not that there's anything wrong with 18-month. Absolutely love it. But we prefer, a more seasoned barrel. So we've gone back to all 24-month.
Okay.
But that's been, since the barrel availability has come back. But to answer your question, yes, you can tell a difference. And often for me, it represents more of like kind of I would say we see more minty notes than maybe we've ever seen out of the 18-month, as opposed to the 24-month, which pulls more of the kind of heavy, what we call bottom notes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think early on we identified the major difference of kiln dried versus, air dried yarded wood. And that was a major change for us early on in the distillery's history. And from there, just as Rick said, starting to experiment with wood origin, time of yarding, etc.
I know. Was that that input on the different barrels while Dave was still involved with the distiller? Just because I know that was a big project of his, was leaving the wood to air season longer, so much so that there was black tannin dust on the ground underneath it. So was that while he was still with you guys?
Certainly Dave, I would say Nancy Fraley as well as Jake Moritz, but I also have to give a ton of credit to Kelvin Cooperage. They were our original Cooperage partner, and while we have a few that we work with these days, they're still our predominant partner, and they've given us just such great wisdom over the years, even how things apply to our region. I remember before Rick came on board, I had a desire to produce a toasted finished bourbon, and just was excited about it. I was a big fan of some of the others in the market and wanted to see what would happen in Florida. And Rick ultimately made it happen for me. But the advice we got from the gentleman at Kelvin was, look, this takes like 15, 30 days in Kentucky. You're going to have to try this stuff every half hour. It's going to be going rapidly. And what did we end up on, Rick? It was like 9 days in the toasted barrel.
9 days, yeah.
So it's, we lean on anybody. And just like the earlier comment of, do we welcome input from the investors? Absolutely. And do we welcome input from vendors? Absolutely. Anything that we can do to get better.
That is a perfect segue into my next question, which was going to be about finishing. So in addition to the ones you just mentioned, there's also, you've worked with the winery you mentioned earlier, San Sebastian, who's a couple blocks from you, to have a wine finish. You've got some, at least on the Voices of Distilling interview, you had some Armagnac and some Amburana finished barrels, either ready or coming soon. I got to imagine the Amburana was like a couple of days at most in that heat.
Believe it or not, no, we got larger format Armagnac this time, or I'm sorry, Amburana. We got Armagnac on the mind because that one's coming out first. But the Amburana barrels, yeah, we ended up going for 30 days on that one, and I was really happy with it because the note that I was really looking for was stewed apple, and it didn't show up right until that time, and it was pulled out and it was beautiful, and God, we can't wait to put that one out.
I got to ask just on the Amburana because obviously there was a wave of Amburana finished products that came out maybe a year and a half ago, and it's come down a little bit, but suddenly it seemed like everyone was doing it. And I got to be honest, and I've said this before on the podcast, so it won't be a surprise, that I think there was one that I thought did it successfully because it's such a strong flavor. And all I kept getting was like cinnamon perfume almost. So Rick, you said you were expecting this stewed apple note or looking for that stewed apple note. So was that something that you had tried in another product that had used those casks or some other variant and you'd found, or you had just heard that this is something that can come if you give it enough time?
No, that was all product research. We do a lot of product research, and we know, like I've mentioned several times here, that we can only do what we can do, and it's going to taste like our version of it. But I like going in informed. Like Will was talking about the toasted bourbon. We tried several toasted bourbons, and we really landed on one that we wanted to take a look at and see if we could do something similar. And I would say what's on the shelf today is not similar to that at all. But I would say in profile compared to some of the others that we tried, it's a lot closer.
Besides the obvious of it's hot, things are going to finish a little faster in Florida, are there other considerations you have to do for finishing?
I think a big one is freshness of finishing barrels. Things dry out super quickly. So if you're sourcing barrels from Europe or overseas, if you're not getting them fresh or not filling them quickly, it can be really impactful on the quality of the spirit that's going to come out or the influence that the finishing barrel is going to have on the spirit. And that's what makes, I think, our port finished bourbon so special, is it's done in relationship with the San Sebastian winery, as you mentioned, which means we're getting the barrels when they're dripping wet, fresh with port. We're able to refill them instantly, and they're only used one time. We're not doing multiple turns. They go right back to the winery. They love heavy bourbon influence, so it's this kind of symbiotic relationship and barrel exchange program. And that makes a huge impact in our experience.
To the distillers out there listening, ask to get your barrels wet. They will send them to you that way. Sometimes they'll dose them. Sometimes they'll throw a little bit of that product back into the barrel and they'll send it to you with, a liter or two, and it massively helps.
It really does. And I know there's a legal limit technically on how much can be in there, but nobody's really measuring it. That's different if you throw like 5 gallons of port in the barrel and then put the bourbon in. That might be a little different. But
I'm sorry, I should clarify on that, David. I don't mean leave the liter in there and fill the barrel with it in there. I mean, once you get the barrel, roll it out, but it keeps the barrel fresh when you get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to confuse that as well. I wasn't implying that it was like blended in with the bourbon. More so that in an effort to keep the barrel wet, if you were taking it from Europe, as Will said, for example, like you'd need to do something like that. But if you're, as close as San Sebastian is to you, you don't need that. You just put it on the truck.
Yes, exactly.
Bring it over.
Just roll them down the sidewalk, David. It works perfectly.
Exactly, and you get a lot of exercise, and you'll probably lose more water than the barrel will. So, at this point, you're celebrating. You did celebrate, excuse me, your 10th anniversary, and you have about 6,000 barrels aging. At that event, you mentioned, you referred to this earlier, you had a blend that had some of the 9-year in there, not a lot, obviously, because there wasn't a lot to go around, but some in the blend that was out for the event. Those have lost like 70%. Again, we throw that number out there again. A question that always comes to mind in these cases, and it applies to places like Texas and distilleries we've talked to in New Mexico and Arizona as well. How do you manage that level of evaporative loss without an exorbitant end cost to the consumer? Just because you have so much less product.
I mean, transparently, that was the most expensive product we've ever released. So I think there is an economic reality to it. It was a blend of 4 barrels, all like 9 years, 30 days. It was kind of funny because it was our 10-year anniversary, but the bourbon wasn't quite 10 years old. But it was certainly the oldest we had released. And at that time, the highest proof we'd released too, because just like Barrel 125 that Rick and you were speaking on, these remained in the facility here at St. Augustine Distillery. And we tend, due to airflow and conditions, they spike a little bit more in proof. So ended up at 126.1. And it was a blend of 3 barrels. And Rick, we yielded less than 200 bottles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you can tell the dramatic loss there, but there is at the end of the day a business and economic reality of it. If you're losing that much product, it's going to create an expensive product.
For sure. And this may be a very niche question, but for the few barrels that are aged at the facility versus the ones that are 20 miles away, do you notice a significant difference from being close on right on the water as opposed to being a little bit inland?
Yes, absolutely. Every now and again, we'll get a few barrels out of the warehouse that'll be briny. I mean, I love it. It's got this nice kind of salinated note to it, and it's really fun and unique, but it's not common. I'd say it's probably 1 out of every 30 or 40 barrels, but they're always a fun one. I usually try to pick those for single barrel picks.
We've had a couple of coastals that sorry, just to throw in there. We've had a couple coastal distilleries on the podcast. I love when they have those saline notes in there.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason. Like salt just makes everything pop a little more, and I love it. Sorry, Will, go ahead.
Sometimes hits me with the most descriptive tasting notes, and I know what he's getting at, but in my mind it throws me off. And one of them was squid ink, and I'm like, I get it, man. You mean saline, but just say that. But I just want to be clear: our warehouse is, first of all, only about 10 miles from our facility, so very, very similar environment, and it is also right on the water. It's on an area we call the Marsh here in St. Augustine, where we're on San Sebastian River. So the influence is there in both facilities. I think what causes the stark difference, certainly in proof, is our distillery proper is open all day long, right? We've got a big door leading into production and a big door leading onto the tour side, and we get this incredible funnel of air right through the facility that just has a unique effect on the limited barrels that we keep here.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's true. I should have asked where the facility was, because that makes a big difference. This question just came to mind. I haven't had to ask this since we spoke with, I believe, Burnt Church in the Carolinas. Do you guys have to hurricane proof your facilities?
Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
The question is how many times a year? Yeah, we just bit the bullet 2 years ago and got shutters put on our historic facility. Luckily, you can barely see them. They're painted pretty discreet. But yeah, I mean, it's a reality. You know, this area suffered a number of impactful hurricanes before Rick and I were a part of the organization. This distillery was hit by Hurricane Matthew, as was most of St. Augustine, and you know, we took on a lot of water in the facility, and Danny has helped us get better at prepping the building every single year since that storm, and we've got it down to a science. But man, nothing makes you realize how many doors you have till you have to put sandbags on all of them.
For sure. No, I'm speaking to Burn Church. They're near Hilton Head, right out on the coast. So yeah, they were the first distillery I'd spoken to, 150 plus, that was like, yeah, we actually have to have hurricane proof glass. They have this beautiful glass, like stained glass on the top of their facility because it's the church theme, and they had to have hurricane proof glass. It's like, I've never had to talk about that before. So, you know, going forward in Florida, and if I ever talk to people in Houston and around the Gulf, these are things you got to think about a little more.
Oh yeah, it's a reality. And
It's a reality.
one of my favorite stories that did come out of it, though, we have a few barrels that
Yes.
product that was in the fermenters during Hurricane Matthew. We lost power, as you'd imagine, for several weeks after the storm. But for whatever reason, the weather stayed cool, and these ferments were able to go. How long was it? Like 11 days before they got pulled out of the fermenter?
I don't remember exactly, but it was quite a while.
Really extended fermentation and a really unique influence on these barrels. We've yet to release them, but certainly something creative you might see from us in the future.
Look, I mean, E.H. Taylor has that tornado survivor
Mm-hmm.
thing, and Warehouse C, and I know those barrels and those bottles go for like hundreds of dollars, if not thousands, on secondary markets. Now, I'm not suggesting that for you guys, but there's clearly a market for this survived a disaster. You know, what is it like? I'm still waiting for Barton to do that from the warehouse that collapsed a couple of years ago.
Oh boy.
Maybe they will. But I don't know. Anyway, so so we briefly spoke about the Florida straight bourbon, the port bourbon as well. I got to give you some time to talk about the Saint, because if there's one thing I want to try from this distillery, I have to try the straight because I need to see what the core is. But other than that, the Saint is so unique and so different. So I'll throw it to you guys to talk about that.
You want me to talk about that one?
I could start about where it begins.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So one of the things we battle against here is kind of convenience. You know, a lot of our folks are visiting St. Augustine. They're going to go back to a hotel room, so we have to give them a way to make a good cocktail at home. So we have a line of mixers that are produced, you know, real juices, no preservatives, like really quality things that you can make a good cocktail. And we have everything from a mule with our vodka to a gin and tonic to a kind of a tropical tiki style cocktail for our rum. But then, of course, the number one, we make an incredible old fashioned mix, which is really aged in our bourbon barrels. So it's two types of bitters, orange peel, sugar, and water, aged in our bourbon barrels for about 8 weeks or so, and then bottled up. And then those barrels are then employed by Rick and his team, and I'll let him take it from here on how it becomes the Saint.
Yeah, absolutely. So the story is, the first time that we did this, we made this old fashioned mix. We got a call. And we were like, "What do you want us to do with these barrels?" And the CEO was like, "Send them back to me." So we came up with this plan to take the oldest bourbon stocks that we had, put them back in the barrels that had aged the old fashioned mix, and let them go for a little bit longer and see what happens. And from that was birthed the Saint. So these days, what we do is we typically take stock that's roughly 5 years old. We take that out of the barrel, we send the barrels off, we get those barrels back, and then these days we're going for about an additional year and a half. And each barrel is unique, so we release seasons. So you'll see like 25A, 25B. We'll pull several of them each year, and they each have a little bit of a different character to them. So when I go out and I select these barrels, you'll find some that are a little more kind of root bitter heavy. You'll find some that are a little more sweet orange heavy. You'll find this whole spectrum. So I try to match a few barrels, and it's always a blend of 5 barrels, by the way. So I'll find a few barrels that really complement each other, but each time they're a little bit different. We release them at cast strength, and we just think we've got something nice here.
It's, as far as we know, it's the only old fashioned finished bourbon in the country, which alone makes it, worth the time to investigate and stuff. But it just sounds good. There are a lot of bourbons where I should say, get notes of an old fashioned. You get the orange peel, maybe in some of them, or a little of the brown sugar notes, and that's why the old fashioned works so well with bourbon. Yes, I know it works well with rye too. Not what we're talking about. Anyway, so I heard this and I saw it, and it is a great idea. And as you said, Rick, it's what do we do with the barrels?
Yeah.
And that's usually the question, because the bourbon, you can only use it once anyway. So what do you do after that? And I love the repurposing and the reuse of that, and the willingness to try it. Do you remember offhand, like how many trials you had to go through to get
Actually, I think my favorite kind of story of the origin of this is the first batch we used barrels we didn't like, ones that we weren't super fond of. And then the distillers brought it to Philip, our founder, and had him taste it. And Philip said, "That's amazing. Who made that?" And the distiller said, "We did." He said, "With what?" And they got to learn the story. It's like, a lot of times if you're not leaning full into a project, certainly if it's something that there isn't kind of marketplace proof of its effectiveness or quality that you're trying to achieve, you're not going to start with your very best, very oldest barrels. You're going to see what you can do on a smaller scale or on a smaller level. But then, the proof was in the pour, you might say.
Yeah.
And we took it from there.
And I'd like to remind my production guys all the time that this entire business was started by farmers who were trying to not let their grain rot. They had to figure out a way to ferment it and then eventually to distill it to capture all these things. So, the spirit of reuse and innovation is in this business everywhere. And anytime that we can take a barrel and we can find a second use for it, not be wasteful, we're going to do it.
Love it. So with the last 15 minutes or so I've got you guys, I wanted to talk also about a little more 30,000-foot view of Florida and spirits industry there, and then bring it back around to finish off at the distillery again. So one of the two, I should say, of the areas that you guys have been really pushing forward, you helped create the Florida Distillers Guild, the Craft Spirits Association. The Craft Spirits Association alone has over 50 members now. There are over 100 craft distilleries across Florida when you were the third. This is amazing growth. And we don't think, I don't think of Florida necessarily as a big distilling state, just because of that whole investment question. Like, there's not those other investments that also bring in portfolio managers and notoriety and things like that. We think of, New York, California, Texas, obviously Kentucky and Tennessee and Indiana, but with over 100 distilleries, Florida's got to be at least in top 10 of distilleries in the state, I would think. So in creating the guild and the association, having the laws changed 4 times so far, for the benefit of craft distillers, what kind of responsibility, if you will, do you feel for the growth of Florida spirits production and the direction in which it's going?
Responsibility. I think now it's just an honor to have played a part in the growth of this industry. And, we're certainly still involved. I'm personally on the board of the Florida Craft Spirits Association, but we're proud to have these wins alongside this community. In the early days, it was one and just a couple of other distilleries putting the time and money involved in these legislative changes. And then it became a voice of, over 50 members, nearly 80 members. And it shifted into us understanding having a common message, right? Every distillery has a different growth plan, a different business plan, and you need to be cohesive when you work with legislators. You need to come to the table with 2 or 3 points that you all agree on. And the last big bill passed in 2021, I think, was a great example of the distilling industry throughout the state working together ahead of any legislative asks to say, this is stuff that pushes us all forward. A great example of that is a huge piece of this is cocktail sales. That's not a part of our business here at St. Augustine Distillery. We have a bar next door, right? But we knew it was important that distilleries all over the state. We were proud to be a part of it. And the landscape has just changed so significantly. We're redesigning a space in what we call our museum here at the distillery that kind of tells the story of where it's come from. And as Rick said earlier in this interview, when we started, we couldn't even sell bottles direct to visitors. Believe it or not, our gift shop is designed on the property, bar and restaurant, so we could use a full 4COP license to do 3-tier selling, which is hilarious if you think about it. We're making product here, gets shipped to our distributor in Tampa, brought back to the same facility to be sold to the customer. Kind of wacky.
Yeah.
And then we earned the right to sell 2 bottles per calendar year, 2 of any label per calendar year, then 6 of any label. And then to be where we are these days, I think the number of distilleries is a great indicator of how we've helped remove these barriers to entry. And we're proud to have helped grow this industry. And look, Rick and I been a part of this business kind of as consumers and fans, Rick in the bar world, myself as an enthusiast, and to be here now working, representing this company and working for the guys that really made this change happen and working in the community of distillers that made this change happen is just something we're both incredibly proud of.
I think the responsibility for us is being a part of the conversation. You know, it's we understand that we're one of 100, and we understand that we were here early, and a lot of people look up to what we do, specifically with tourism. But that by no means means that we get to drive the conversation. We're in it, you know, and we're happy to be here.
That's fantastic. I ask because we know there are guilds and associations across the country. Each state seems to be building one, which is fantastic for the industry as a whole. It's fantastic for the states individually. But having just, you know, because I'm in New York, I'll give this example. The idea of Empire Rye in New York, there are a couple of distilleries that started that, you know, 6 distilleries started that. And now there's a lot more that are a part of it. And some of the distilleries that started are still at the forefront and pushing for this. And some have they're still very involved, but they've taken a step back in terms of kind of leading the charge. And they're like, let others move it forward. So that's kind of where that question comes from. I love knowing when you've started something, how far you take it, and when you let others kind of take the reins and let others see where it's going to go. So with that same idea, actually, I think that's a good parallel to the growth of Lincolnville. I know, Will, early in the episode, you mentioned there's going to be a hotel opened right nearby, 450 rooms. That's a fairly significant one. So, you know, we've had many guests who are seeking to revitalize their community. And that could be through anything, through economic investment, could be repopulation in a lot of cases, especially in Scotland and the UK. Or something else. And in St. Augustine Distillers, we have the opportunity in many ways to see the fruits of that labor because you've been around for a decade plus and have worked with the local, the city, the county, to revitalize this district. How else has this district grown, and what does it look like today that you couldn't have seen 10 years ago?
It's an area that people want to vacation to. I think the good and the bad is some of it has transitioned to kind of Airbnbs and vacation home rentals and stuff, but it's kept the historic charm, and it's just a part of the city. If you came, you wouldn't have experienced before. And now if you do, whether you're on the trolley to take a swing through Lincolnville and hopefully stop by St. Augustine Distillery, or just taking a drive to see it, it's a part you'd want to enjoy and experience. So I think that's kind of it for me, just seeing that evolve into a place you want to see when you visit this great city.
Awesome. I assume too, I mean, the job growth that's happened just at the distillery, you said you have a team of about 50, I think. And however many are going to come in from the hotel and from more people visiting the area is a big economic driver. So, you guys deserve some credit for that. And I think that was, for me, I'm just mentioning that because I think, at least in the research I did, that was kind of lacking, was the focus on, no, this was, you guys went into an area that was not economically doing well, and put investment in. 10 years later, here we are. So I think it's worth mentioning. And so with that, I come to my last question, which I almost always ask, which is, for you both, what do you want your legacies to be for the distillery? And then after that, what do you guys want the distillery's legacy to be?
That's a great question. Rick,
Yeah.
you got
Okay, so the question is, what do I want my legacy to be for the distillery, and what do I want the legacy of the distillery to be overall?
Yes.
Okay. Well, for me, I just want to make the best booze I possibly can. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think it was the Neat documentary where Freddie Johnson gets in front of people, and he says something to the effect of, a young distiller comes in and they take somebody else's juice and they blend it and they make a good product, and then they start to formulate their ideas and they get working on theirs. And 6 years later, they get to try their first go at it, right? And they go, could have tweaked something a little bit. And 6 years later, they get to try their second go, and they're like, man, I got it down now, but the sad reality is you're making booze for posterity at that point, and I think if there's anything that I really want to achieve here, I want to build something great, a system that really continually defines excellence, that makes sure that all of our production and the rest of the staff feels like they understand what we're doing. They're very, very smart on spirits in general, and that when people come in here, they smile, they pick up a bottle, and they are really happy with what they're tasting, and they understand what we're after here. Now, for the distillery overall, I think the story is just continuing to invite people in. I mean, we know that we're in a tourist area. We know that we're in Florida and people want to come visit us here. And I think the best thing that we can possibly do is, instead of trying to be a legacy brand where you look on the shelf and you say, oh, that's been around 100 years, like I got to try it. They know what they're doing. I think instead I want an emotional reaction for the brand. I want people to pick up a bottle of St. Augustine Distillery and think, man, I had about the best 5 days of my life in St. Augustine. So I think we can be a big part of that, and I think that's really our legacy as a company.
All right, we'll follow that up.
I think that shouldn't have let him go first.
Sorry, Will.
For me here at the distillery, my position is building people up, right? So what do I want to leave behind? Well, just much like Rick, I want to make sure we're creating a product that's worthy of the price that we're charging, something that a whiskey fan, whether you're a newcomer or enthusiast, will say, damn, that's interesting. They're making some great bourbon in the state of Florida. But what really drives me is building people. I want to make sure people's experience here, certainly guests, but our employees, whether you're a cashier, a tour guide, or a head distiller, benefits you and your life. Growing on, whether it's within our organization or to the next step, we want to build people. And that's what we're excited for. We always say our favorite thing is happy alumni. We just had one of our longtime tour managers, a woman who really helped reshape our tour program, shout out Laura Doolin, announced that she's leaving for another distillery. And while it's bittersweet, I was very excited for Laura's growth. And, it's just, that's what we're about. And Rick said early in this episode, we want to have you when you're great and have you here as long as we can, but we're not going to be mad when you leave, if you leave. So that's kind of what drives me personally. And I think the legacy of the distillery is just having a positive impact on the community. Both of our founders were retired businessmen. We're not a nonprofit, don't get this the wrong way, but creating this business was as much an interest as it was a business opportunity for them. And a big motivating factor for both of them was to have a business that had a positive impact on the community. So you get that certainly from job creation and what the distillery offers, how we've impacted Lincolnville, but it's also what the distillery's been able to achieve. One of our founders was able to sell a business early on in his life, and he visited St. Augustine. This was Philip McDaniel, and fell in love with the city. And this is a story we hear over and over and over again. I'll see a guest, oh, I love it here. They come back next year, wow, I love it here. In the third year, I moved here. And that was Philip's story. And he sold his business and moved here to raise his family. And this is a guy that can't stop. And he was really involved in building up arts and culture, helped convert the St. Augustine Amphitheater into what it is today, founding the Cultural Council, and really just supporting what drove him and his wife and his family, which was arts, music, and culture. And that's still a part of our ethos. We're still a sponsor of the amphitheater. We support the Fort Mosaic Jazz and Blues Festival, which brings unique light on the historic Black settlement, really the first free Black settlement in the Americas. Supporting, working with Habitat for Humanity. We've built 6 homes over the last 7 years. And, I think what drives all of us is to know this business cares and does a good thing. Oh, and by the way, we make some fantastic whiskey that all of you should try.
I love it. Well, Will, Rick, thank you guys for coming on, talking about St. Augustine Distillery, talking about what it's like for the first time in this podcast to distill, mature in Florida, make spirits there. What you guys are doing for the community is just fantastic. Hang on with me for just a second after I finish the recording. Mm-hmm. It's been wonderful to talk to you guys, and I hope to talk to you again real soon. We'll have links in the show notes so you can follow St. Augustine, where you can pick up bottles either at the distillery, ideally, for some of those special releases, online if you can't make it down to Florida or can't make it over to St. Augustine, and in general, where you can try those products. So thank you all for listening. It's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast, and I will see you all next week.